The first thing Charlotte Hayes noticed about the bookstore was the little white chair sitting alone near the window. It was too small for an adult, carefully painted with fading yellow stars, untouched while the rest of the shop looked worn by time and weather. Rain tapped softly against the glass outside as she stepped farther into the narrow aisle, the scent of old paper and coffee wrapping around her expensive wool coat like a world she no longer belonged to. Somewhere deeper inside the shop, a man's voice murmured softly, patient and calm. "You're supposed to shelve the dragons before the princesses, Lily. That's how kingdoms survive." A little girl giggled. Charlotte stopped walking. The sound felt strange in a place this quiet. Warm. Human. She glanced around the tiny bookstore tucked between a laundromat and a closed bakery on the edge of downtown Boston. Nothing about it matched the world she came from. No marble floors. No polished assistants. No cameras waiting outside. Just crooked shelves, handwritten staff recommendations, and soft jazz drifting from an old speaker near the counter. Her father would hate it instantly, which was probably why he had sent her here. Charlotte tightened her grip around the leather folder beneath her arm. "Ms. Hayes?" a small voice asked. She looked down. A little girl with chestnut curls and oversized glasses stood near the children's section, holding a copy of Charlotte's Web against her chest. "Daddy says customers usually smile when they come in." Charlotte blinked once, caught off guard. "I didn't realize I wasn't smiling." "You look like people on business channels," the girl replied honestly. "They always look constipated." A laugh escaped Charlotte before she could stop it. Quick. Real. It startled her almost as much as it startled the little girl. Then a man appeared from behind the shelves carrying a stack of books against his chest. Tall, broad shoulders beneath a rolled gray sweater. Light stubble shadowing his jaw. His tired blue eyes landed on Charlotte first, then narrowed slightly when he noticed the folder in her hands. Ethan Cole, the final obstacle standing between her father and a $40 million redevelopment project. Charlotte had expected someone bitter, aggressive, desperate for money. Instead, he looked calm, worn around the edges maybe, but grounded in a way most powerful men weren't. "Lily," he said gently, "why don't you finish your homework upstairs?" "Okay." The little girl skipped away, but not before whispering loudly to Charlotte. "He makes pancakes every Saturday, but they're terrible." Ethan sighed under his breath. "Traitor." Charlotte watched Lily disappear up the staircase at the back of the shop before finally meeting Ethan's eyes again. Silence stretched between them while rain rolled down the windows beside the empty white chair. "Can I help you?" he asked calmly. Charlotte inhaled slowly. Every board member, every advisor, every person in her father's world had warned her this conversation would require strategy, precision, emotional distance. But standing inside this tiny bookstore, surrounded by bedtime stories and old hardcovers and the smell of cinnamon coffee, the rehearsed speech suddenly sounded cruel in her head. Still, she opened the folder. "My father sent me here," she said quietly. Ethan leaned against the counter, expression unreadable. "That usually means trouble." Charlotte pulled out the contract with steady fingers, even though something uncomfortable had already started twisting in her chest. "He believes you need a wife." Ethan stared at her for 2 long seconds. Then he laughed softly, not amused, not angry, just tired in a way that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. He set the books down carefully before speaking. "Lady," his eyes flicked toward the staircase where his daughter had disappeared moments earlier. "You're 5 years too late." Charlotte said nothing. Ethan looked back at her, and for the first time she noticed the wedding ring still hanging from a thin chain around his neck. "My wife already died once." And somehow, in the middle of the rain-soaked bookstore, surrounded by stories pretending happy endings were simple, Charlotte Hayes suddenly forgot every prepared sentence she had walked in with. Charlotte stood motionless beside the counter while rainwater slid slowly down the bookstore windows. Behind her, Ethan did not touch the contract again. He simply watched her with the kind of exhaustion that came from surviving too many disappointments to fear another one. Somewhere upstairs, Lily's faint footsteps crossed the old wooden floorboards, followed by the muffled sound of a door closing gently. The little white chair near the window remained empty, facing the street like it was still waiting for someone who had been gone a very long time. Charlotte swallowed carefully. "I am not here to insult you," she said at last. Ethan gave a quiet smile without humor. "Funny thing about rich people. They always say that right before they do. The words should have annoyed her. Normally they would have. In boardrooms, nobody spoke to Charlotte Hayes that way. Executives lowered their voices around her. Investors studied her reactions like weather forecasts. But Ethan sounded honest instead of intimidated, and somehow that unsettled her more. She closed the folder slowly. My father owns Hayes Urban Development. Ethan nodded once. I know who he is. Then you know he bought almost every property on this block. Except this one. His voice stayed calm, but Charlotte noticed the subtle shift in his posture, protective, instinctive, like a man standing in front of something fragile. My father believes this neighborhood needs modernization. Ethan glanced around the bookstore shelves lined with dog-eared novels and children's drawings taped near the register. That is a fancy word for destroying things people cannot replace. Charlotte opened her mouth, then stopped. Because for the first time in months, she was not completely sure her father was right. Earlier that morning, she had stood in a 73rd floor conference room overlooking downtown Boston, while men in expensive suits discussed this neighborhood like numbers on a spreadsheet. Coffee shops, independent stores, rent displacement projections, quarterly revenue. Nobody had mentioned children reading on tiny white chairs beside rainy windows. Nobody had mentioned grief hanging quietly from a silver chain around a widower's neck. Ethan stepped behind the counter and began organizing a stack of returned books with careful hands. You should go home, Ms. Hayes. Charlotte, I do not think using first names is going to help this situation. His tone stayed polite, but distant. Charlotte hesitated before speaking again. You are behind on property taxes. Ethan did not react immediately. That silence told her enough. And the city can legally force a sale within 6 months. Ethan placed another book onto the shelf. I know how deadlines work. Then you know you cannot win this alone. Finally, he looked at her again. His blue eyes carried no anger now, only fatigue. Do you know what my daughter asked me 3 nights ago? Charlotte said nothing. She asked if they were going to tear down the corner bakery too. His jaw tightened slightly. Because her mother used to buy cinnamon rolls there every Sunday morning. The air inside the bookstore suddenly felt too warm. Charlotte glanced toward the rain outside, uncomfortable with the heaviness settling in her chest. I am trying to help. Ethan let out a soft breath. No, Charlotte. You are trying to negotiate. Before she could answer, footsteps raced down the stairs again. Lily appeared carrying a shoebox covered in faded stickers. Daddy, I found the old pictures. Ethan's expression softened instantly. Lily, sweetheart, we talked about going through those later. But Lily was already kneeling beside the coffee table, flipping through photographs with childish determination. Charlotte caught glimpses of birthdays, beach trips, a woman with bright eyes and auburn hair laughing beside Ethan under summer sunlight. Then Lily pulled out one crayon drawing and held it proudly toward Charlotte. That is my mommy. Charlotte looked down at the picture. 3 stick figures stood in front of the bookstore beneath a bright yellow sun. A little white chair sat beside them. Above the drawing, written in uneven handwriting, were the words, Mommy always comes back. Something invisible seemed to crack quietly inside Ethan's expression. He looked away first. Charlotte stared at the drawing longer than she meant to, feeling a strange ache settle somewhere deep beneath all the polished walls she had spent years building. Around herself, and for the first time since entering the bookstore, she completely forgot about the contract waiting inside her folder. Charlotte left the bookstore nearly 20 minutes later, but the rain outside no longer felt cold against her skin. She stood beneath the awning across the street for a moment, staring through the fogged window at Ethan shelving books, while Lily sat cross-legged near the little white chair coloring quietly with pink markers spread across the floor. From a distance, the scene looked impossibly small compared to the world Charlotte knew. Yet somehow it felt more alive than the 73rd floor office tower waiting for her downtown. Her driver opened the back door of the black sedan. Miss Hayes. She blinked once and climbed inside without answering. The city lights blurred beyond the rain-streaked windows as the car pulled away from the neighborhood. 10 minutes later, Charlotte stepped into the polished marble lobby of Hayes Capital, where everything smelled faintly of expensive perfume and fresh orchids. Assistants moved quickly across the floor carrying tablets and coffee trays while giant digital screens tracked international markets in glowing blue numbers. Her world. Controlled. Sharp-edged. Predictable. Yet the moment she entered the executive boardroom, Her father's voice immediately shattered the fragile quiet still lingering in her thoughts. Well, Richard Hayes stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor, silver cufflinks glinting beneath the recessed lights. At 63, he carried authority the way other men carried briefcases. Calm, heavy, permanent. Charlotte set her folder onto the conference table. He said no. Richard barely reacted. People say no before they say yes. This is different. No, her father replied evenly. You are allowing emotion to complicate leverage. Charlotte loosened the collar of her coat slightly. He is not trying to negotiate. He genuinely wants to keep the bookstore. Richard turned toward her fully now. That building sits on the most valuable undeveloped corner in the district. It is also his home. Her father gave a quiet sigh, like patience. Itself exhausted him. Charlotte, do you know why you are successful? She remained silent. Because you learned early that attachment is expensive. The words landed harder than she expected. Maybe because somewhere deep down, she knew exactly where she had learned that lesson. Richard walked toward the espresso bar near the conference table and poured himself coffee with practiced precision. You are 34 years old. The board already questions why the future face of this company has no husband, no family image, no stability narrative. Charlotte crossed her arms. I am running $1 billion corporation, not auditioning for a lifestyle magazine. Public perception matters. He stirred his coffee once. Especially now. Charlotte stared at the skyline outside the windows. Glass towers glowing against the wet night. Thousands of people moving through tiny lit apartments below. Somewhere across the city, Ethan was probably helping Lily brush her teeth before bed while old jazz music played softly downstairs in that little bookstore. The image arrived so suddenly it unsettled her. You asked me to marry a stranger, she said quietly. Richard looked unimpressed. I asked you to solve a problem. By manipulating a widower raising a child alone. By offering him survival. His voice hardened slightly. That man is 6 months away from losing everything. Charlotte looked back at him sharply. How do you know that? Richard took a slow sip of coffee. Because I already reviewed his financial records. Something cold moved through her chest. You investigated him? I prepare. Charlotte suddenly thought about the wedding ring hanging around Ethan's neck. Lily's drawing. The little white chair waiting beside the bookstore window like grief itself had taken physical form. His wife died from cancer 3 years ago. Richard continued matter-of-factly. Medical debt nearly buried him afterward. He refinanced twice to keep that bookstore open. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. Enough. Reality usually sounds cruel when spoken out loud. He set down the coffee cup carefully. Here is the reality you need to understand. Ethan Cole will eventually lose that building. The only question is whether he loses it broken and alone or protected under our terms. Charlotte said nothing for several seconds. Then quietly, almost to herself, she asked, and what exactly are our terms? Her father finally slid a second folder across the table toward her. Inside sat a clean legal draft already prepared in advance. Temporary marriage agreement. 12 months. Public appearances required. Financial protection clauses. Property retention guarantees. Charlotte stared at the papers while rain rolled softly against the giant windows behind her. Then her eyes landed on one final handwritten note from her father clipped to the last page. Sometimes people accept love faster than charity. And for reasons she could not explain, Charlotte suddenly hated the sentence more than anything she had read in years. Charlotte barely slept that night. Long after midnight, she sat alone inside her penthouse apartment overlooking the Charles River, the untouched marriage agreement resting on the kitchen counter beside a cold cup of tea. The city below glowed silver beneath the rain, thousands of headlights moving through wet streets like restless thoughts refusing to settle. Usually she loved nights like this. Quiet, controlled, predictable. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the little white chair beside the bookstore window. Mommy always comes back. The words lingered in her chest with a strange heaviness she could not shake. Around 2 in the morning, Charlotte finally stood and walked barefoot across the dark apartment toward the massive windows. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. Perfect hair, silk blouse, diamond watch. A woman who had spent years learning how to survive without needing anyone. Her father used to call it strength. Suddenly it looked more like loneliness. Her phone buzzed softly against the marble counter. Evelyn Pierce, Chief Communications Officer. Charlotte answered quietly. What is it? The board moved tomorrow's dinner up to 7. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Of course they did. Your father wants you there early. Investors from Chicago are attending. Evelyn hesitated before adding. Carefully, they are expecting an announcement soon. Charlotte understood exactly what that meant. A future marriage. A stable public image. A continuation of the Hayes legacy wrapped in expensive smiles and strategic photographs. Cancel my morning meetings, she said softly. Charlotte, just do it. After the call ended, silence returned to the apartment. Heavy. Hollow. She looked toward the contract again. 12 months. Public appearances. Financial protection. Property retention. The terms sounded clinical on paper. But somewhere beneath the legal language sat a frightened little girl waiting beside an empty chair for someone who would never walk back through the door again. By 9 the next morning, Boston carried that pale gray light that always arrived before another storm. Charlotte parked outside the bookstore herself this time, without the driver or security detail. The neighborhood smelled faintly of wet pavement and fresh bread from the bakery on the corner. She spotted Ethan immediately through the window, balancing on a ladder while rearranging books on a high shelf. His sweater sleeves were rolled to his elbows, exposing faded ink stains across his hands. Real hands, she thought unexpectedly. Hands that fixed things instead of signing papers that destroyed them. When she entered, the small bell above the door chimed softly. Ethan glanced down from the ladder and sighed under his breath. You came back. I need 5 minutes. Most disasters start with that sentence. Charlotte almost smiled despite herself. Lily sat at the children's table coloring carefully with purple crayons. The moment she saw Charlotte, her face brightened. You came back too. The simple warmth in the little girl's voice caught Charlotte off guard again. Nobody in her world ever sounded genuinely happy to see her. Ethan climbed down slowly from the ladder. Lily, sweetheart, can you help Mr. Bennett next door carry muffins later? Only if he gives me the blueberry ones. You drive a hard bargain. Lily grinned before returning to her coloring book. Charlotte watched the interaction quietly. There was something effortless about Ethan with his daughter. No performance. No carefully managed image. Just patience and love woven naturally into every sentence. Ethan crossed his arms lightly. All right, 5 minutes. Charlotte reached into her bag and removed the contract. But this time she did not place it on the counter immediately. I read the terms myself. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerous. You keep the bookstore. In exchange for? A temporary marriage. Ethan stared at her without expression. Rain tapped softly against the bookstore windows again, while jazz hummed low from the old speaker near the register. No, he said simply. Charlotte blinked once. You did not even hear the details. I heard enough yesterday. His voice stayed calm. My daughter already lost one family. I am not turning her life into some public relations campaign. Charlotte swallowed carefully. It would protect Lily too. That made him pause. Just slightly. Charlotte noticed it immediately. You said yourself the city could force a sale. Ethan looked toward the little white chair near the window before answering. You know what the funny thing is? What? Everybody keeps offering to save this place. His eyes returned to hers. Nobody asks what it costs us afterward. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lily suddenly looked up from her coloring book. Daddy. Yes, sweetheart. If Charlotte marries you, she frowned thoughtfully. Does that mean she has to eat your pancakes too? Ethan closed his eyes briefly while Charlotte let out a surprised laugh before she could stop herself. Lily looked deeply concerned. Because they are honestly not very good. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Charlotte Hayes laughed loudly enough that the sound filled the entire bookstore. The laughter lingered in the bookstore longer than Charlotte expected. Warm, unexpected, human. She covered her mouth lightly as the sound faded while Ethan looked at her with visible confusion, like he could not remember the last time someone in his shop had laughed that freely. Lily seemed extremely pleased with herself. See, she announced proudly. I told you the pancakes were serious. Ethan rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. I suddenly regret teaching you honesty. Charlotte shook her head, still smiling faintly. No, I think honesty might be the healthiest thing in this building. Ethan studied her carefully after that. The sharp edges she carried into the bookstore yesterday seemed softer somehow, less guarded beneath the rainy morning light filtering through the windows. For a brief second, he could almost imagine what she looked like outside expensive boardrooms and corporate dinners. Lily hopped off her chair and carried her coloring book toward the register. I am hungry. You had cereal 20 minutes ago, Ethan reminded her. That was emotionally unsatisfying. Charlotte laughed again before she could stop herself. Ethan pointed toward the bakery next door. Fine. Go help Mr. Bennett with the muffin trays. Lily gasped dramatically. Blueberry. One blueberry. You drive a terrible bargain too. She grabbed her little raincoat from the hook by the stairs before stopping beside Charlotte. Do not leave yet. Slightly. Look, Charlotte, you seem decent enough. That sounded painful for you to admit. Extremely. A faint smile tugged briefly at the corner of his mouth before fading again. But this arrangement would confuse Lily. It could also protect her. At what emotional price? Charlotte hesitated, because that was the question she had been avoiding since the moment she walked back into the bookstore. Ethan stepped closer to the counter, lowering his voice slightly. Do you know what happens when children start trusting someone? Charlotte shook her head slowly. They believe you will stay. The words landed quietly between them, heavy enough to silence the entire room. Charlotte looked away first. Outside, traffic hissed softly through rain-covered streets, while somewhere nearby church bells echoed faintly across the neighborhood. She thought about her own childhood suddenly. Giant empty dining rooms, boarding schools, nannies rotating every 6 months, a father who provided everything except presents. Attachment is expensive. She hated how clearly she could still hear Richard Hayes saying it. Ethan noticed the shift in her expression. What? Charlotte folded her arms lightly. Nothing. That is usually not true. She exhaled slowly. When I was 11, I broke my arm during a horseback competition. Ethan waited quietly. My father sent flowers to the hospital. A small bitter laugh escaped her. White orchids. Neighborhood. Mr. Bennett grinned knowingly while Charlotte felt unexpected heat rise to her cheeks. And standing there in the middle of the little bookstore, surrounded by rain, blueberry muffins, and the smell of old pages, Charlotte Hayes realized something quietly terrifying. For the first time in years, she did not want to leave. 3 days later, Charlotte Hayes stood beneath a chandelier worth more than Ethan's entire bookstore, while photographers shouted her name from behind velvet ropes. The annual Hayes Foundation Winter Gala filled the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza with crystal glasses, polished smiles, and people who spoke in numbers instead of emotions. Usually Charlotte moved through events like this effortlessly. Calm handshake, controlled smile, perfect answers delivered in elegant sentences. But tonight, every conversation felt strangely hollow. Charlotte, over here. Miss Hayes, is it true the redevelopment project closes this month? Are wedding rumors with Senator Whitmore accurate? She answered automatically while cameras flashed around her, but her attention drifted repeatedly toward the ballroom entrance. She hated herself slightly for noticing. At exactly 7:22, Ethan walked in wearing a charcoal suit that looked borrowed from another life. Charlotte saw the discomfort in his posture instantly. He stood taller than most men in the room, yet somehow looked more out of place than anyone there. Lily held his hand tightly beside him in a pale blue dress with tiny silver stars sewn across the skirt. The moment Charlotte saw her, she forgot every investor in the room existed. Lily's eyes widened beneath the enormous chandelier overhead. Daddy, she whispered loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. This place looks like Elsa got rich. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Charlotte laughed softly before walking toward them. Every conversation around the ballroom seemed to quiet slightly as she approached. Ethan noticed it immediately. Everybody here watches you like they are waiting for stock prices to change, he murmured. They usually are. Lily spun slowly beneath the lights. I feel fancy. Charlotte smiled. Despite herself. You look beautiful. Lily beamed. Relatable. People respond emotionally to stories like that. Ethan's entire expression hardened almost invisibly. Could not hear the words, but she saw Lily smile and nod before slipping her hand into his. That simple movement hit Charlotte unexpectedly hard. Beneath it read, Future of Hayes Capital built on family values. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Not anger. Worse. Realization. Charlotte stepped toward the microphone quickly. Mornings. Walked slowly toward the shelves near the reading corner, fingertips brushing old book spines as she moved. Why did you really say no? Ethan frowned slightly. To the arrangement. Charlotte turned toward him again. You need help. Your bookstore is struggling. The taxes alone, because Lily already buried one mother. His voice stayed quiet. I could survive losing this place. I could survive losing money. He looked toward the staircase. I could not survive watching her get attached to someone who leaves. The room suddenly felt too small around Charlotte. You think I would leave? Ethan exhaled softly. I think your world would eventually ask you to. That hurt more than she expected, because somewhere deep down, she feared he might be right. Charlotte sat slowly in the little white chair near the window before realizing what she had done. Ethan noticed instantly. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Rain rolled softly down the glass behind her, while warm yellow light from the reading lamp wrapped around the small corner of the bookstore. Charlotte looked strangely natural there, sitting beside children's books and scattered crayons instead of skyscrapers and conference tables. Ethan stared a second too long before looking away. Lily leaves that chair empty on purpose, he said quietly. Charlotte rested her hands lightly in her lap. For her mother. Yeah. She swallowed carefully. And if someone else sat there? Ethan met her eyes then. Tired blue against guarded gray. That depends. On what? His voice softened almost to a whisper. Whether they plan to stay. Charlotte felt her chest tighten painfully. Because for the first time in years, she wanted to answer honestly. And that terrified her more than anything. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale winter sunlight and silence. Charlotte sat alone in her office high above Boston, while untouched emails crowded across her computer screen. Acquisition reports, investor concerns, press requests about the gala. Normally, she handled pressure with perfect precision. Today, all she could think about was a small bookstore smelling like coffee and rain and old paper. Whether they planned to stay. Ethan's voice had followed her home like a question she could no longer avoid answering. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Come in. Evelyn Pierce stepped inside carrying a tablet. Her expression already warned Charlotte that something was wrong. The board scheduled an emergency meeting. Charlotte frowned. Why? Evelyn hesitated carefully. Your father accelerated the redevelopment vote. Charlotte stood immediately. What? The bookstore block goes before the city council tomorrow morning. Cold anger settled through her chest. That was supposed to happen next month. Your father thinks public sympathy after the gala makes this the perfect time. Charlotte grabbed her coat without another word. 40 minutes later, she pushed through the bookstore door hard enough for the bell above it to rattle. Ethan looked up from behind the counter instantly. One glance at her expression and his shoulders tightened. What happened? Lily sat near the reading corner, building a castle from old picture books. She looked between them nervously. Charlotte barely caught her breath before speaking. The vote moved up. Ethan went still. How soon? Tomorrow morning. Silence swallowed the bookstore. Outside, snow had started falling softly across the street, tiny white flakes drifting past the windows. Lily looked toward her father carefully. Does that mean they can take the store? Ethan forced a calm smile for her. Hey, we do not know that yet. But Charlotte could hear the strain underneath his voice now. The fear, the exhaustion, years of fighting alone finally catching up with him. Lily stared down at the floor quietly. Mommy loved this place. Ethan looked away for half a second, and that tiny break in composure hurt Charlotte more than anything else had. She stepped forward before thinking. They are not taking it. Ethan frowned slightly. Charlotte, I mean it. She turned toward him fully. I can stop the vote. How? Charlotte swallowed once. By stepping down from the project publicly. Ethan stared at her. Your father would never forgive that. Maybe I am finally okay with that. The room went completely still. Even Lily stopped moving. Charlotte exhaled shakily before continuing. I spent my whole life becoming the person he wanted. Successful, untouchable, efficient. Her eyes drifted toward the little white chair near the window. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what home was supposed to feel like. Ethan said nothing. He simply watched her with those tired blue eyes that somehow always saw through every carefully built wall she carried. Charlotte stepped closer slowly. You asked me last night whether I plan to stay. Ethan's voice softened. Charlotte, I do not know what this is yet. Her honesty trembled slightly. But I know I am tired of pretending I do not care. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly in the apartment above them while snow continued falling outside the bookstore windows. Lily suddenly stood from the floor, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. Does this mean you are staying for pancakes? Ethan closed his eyes briefly, like he was trying not to laugh and fall apart at the same time. Charlotte looked at Lily and smiled through tears she had not realized were there. Even the terrible pancakes. Lily gasped happily before throwing her arms around Charlotte's waist so quickly it startled both adults. Charlotte froze for one heartbeat. Then slowly, carefully, she wrapped her arms around the little girl too. Ethan watched the scene silently from behind the counter, emotion moving visibly across his face before he looked down at the wedding ring hanging around his neck. For years, grief had lived inside this bookstore like a permanent winter. Quiet, patient, unmoving. But standing there beneath the soft snowfall and warm yellow lights, Ethan suddenly realized something impossible had happened. Somewhere between the contract, the gala, and the little white chair by the window, Charlotte Hayes had stopped feeling like a visitor. She felt like someone finding her way home.